Studies Section 10, The Problem of Consciousness. Introduction. The notion of consciousness is easily the main focus of the aspect of metaphysics referred to as philosophy of mind. And so, the question that is raised in this area of discourse is, what is consciousness? Put differently, what is it to be conscious? How do you distinguish the conscious from the unconscious? And what sort of things are capable of consciousness? Questions such as these shall be the focus of this study section. Since the notion of consciousness is specifically related to the mind, the study section therefore examines the meaning and nature of the mind. In other words, what is the mind and what are the functions of the mind? In discussing these issues, the session shall examine two theories of consciousness, to wit the first person and the third person theories of consciousness. You will also learn about the central question of consciousness and how it is different from the state of unconsciousness. In addition, you will learn the differences between behaviorism and introspectionism. Learning outcomes for study section 10. When you have studied this section, you should be able to discuss the concept of consciousness, explain the theories of consciousness, concept of consciousness. The term consciousness is also commonly used to refer to a state of wakefulness. Being awake or asleep or in some other state, such as coma, clearly influences what one can be conscious of, but it is not the same as being conscious in the sense of having phenomenal content. When sleeping, for example, you can still have visual and auditory experiences in the form of dreams. Conversely, when awake, there are many things at any given moment that one does not experience. So, in a variety of contexts, it is necessary to distinguish consciousness in the sense of phenomenal consciousness from wakefulness and other states of arousal, such as dream, sleep, deep sleep, and coma. The most fundamental and commonly used notion of conscious is captured by Thomas Nagel's famous "What It Is Like" sense. The most fundamental and commonly used notion of conscious is captured by Thomas Nagel's famous "What It Is Like" sense. Consciousness is what it is like to be something. Without it, after all, it would not be like anything to exist. When, for instance, I am in a conscious mental state, there is something it is like for me to be in that state from the subjective or first-person point of view. When I am, for example, smelling a rose or having a conscious visual experience, there is something it seems or feels like from my perspective. An organism such as a bat is conscious if it is able to experience the outer world through its echolocatory senses. There is also something it is like to be a conscious creature, whereas there is nothing it is like to be, for example, a table or tree. In everyday life, there are two contrasting situations which inform our understanding of the term consciousness. You have knowledge of what it is like to be conscious when you are awake, as opposed to not being conscious when in dreamless sleep. You also understand what it is like to be conscious of something when awake or dreaming, as opposed to not being conscious of that thing. This everyday understanding provides a simple place to start. A person or some other entity is conscious if they experience something. Conversely, if a person or entity experiences nothing, they are not conscious. In common usage, the term consciousness is often synonymous with awareness or conscious awareness. The content of consciousness encompasses all that you are conscious of, are aware of, or experience. These include not only experiences that you commonly associate with yourself, such as thoughts, feelings, images, dreams, body sensations, and so on, but also the experienced three-dimensional world, the phenomenal world beyond the body surface. Our conscious lives are the sea in which you swim, so it is not surprising that consciousness is difficult to understand. You consciously experience many different things, and you can think about the things that you experience. But it is not so easy to experience or think about consciousness itself. Traditionally, the puzzles surrounding consciousness have been known as the mind-body problem. However, it is now clear that mind is not quite the same thing as consciousness, and that the aspect of body most closely involved with consciousness is the brain. Consciousness is often held to be that thing which distinguishes man from a good deal of the world around him. To some, it is possessed only by the living and not by the dead or the inorganic which never lived. There is also the view that even among the living, it is not found in plants or in the lower forms of animal life. The problem here, however, is that of where to draw the line dividing those animals which have consciousness from those which do not. Some have therefore reasoned from this far that you cannot draw a line between the non-conscious and the conscious to the conclusion that all animals either possess consciousness altogether or they do not altogether possess consciousness. Whichever of the above views you subscribe to, the question that looms large and which should form the starting point of every inquiry is, what is this thing called consciousness? What is this thing which man probably has, rock doesn't have, and frogs and snakes perhaps have? If one tries to be conscious of a word on paper, what do you get? All you observe is the word on the paper and nothing more. According to G.E. Moore, using a blue patch as its object of consciousness, the moment you try to fix our attention upon consciousness and to see what distinctly it is, it seems to vanish. It seems as if you had before us a mere emptiness. When you try to introspect the sensation of blue, all you can see is the blue. The other elements are as if it were diaphanous, transparent in brackets. This is the result that most of us would get when you try this experiment. Yet, you know perfectly well you are conscious of the word on the page. What therefore is this consciousness? G.T. Ladd characterized consciousness in this way: what you are when you are awake as contrasted with what you are when you sink into a profound and perfectly dreamless sleep. What you are less and less as you sink gradually into dreamless sleep, and what you are more and more as the noise of the crowd outside momentarily arouses us from our after-dinner nap, or as you come out of the midnight darkness of the typhoid fever crisis. How does a bat remain conscious? A bat is conscious if it is able to experience the outer world through its echolocatory senses. Theories of consciousness. The word mind in recent discourse is now much more frequently used to refer to third-person phenomena. Terms in common parlance such as the subconscious mind bear witness to this fact. It has completely been taken over by the cognitive science, which is essentially the third-person investigation of mechanisms of thought, often described as the study of mind. To this extent, the word mind is a general coverall for abstractions from the brain, understood either in the first person or third person. It is no longer a matter of subjective personal experience. This same attitude is applicable to consciousnesses, though this seems to be less often the case. Meanwhile, it is obvious that the mind is caused by a brain, as your thought is being supported by a pattern of neutral activity in your brain. Basically, you have two major theories or accounts of consciousness. These are the first person or the subjective account, which results from attending to how things are in one's own case, and the third person or the objective account, which results from attending to how things are when someone else is conscious in some way. Let us examine first the third person account of consciousness. The third person or objective account of consciousness. When you ask a man who has been hit on the head whether he is conscious, what do you mean? What do you expect to find out if you are told he is conscious, and what do you also expect if you are told he is unconscious? You expect that if he is conscious, he will respond to stimuli and not respond otherwise. In other words, you expect certain kinds of behavior under certain stimuli. From this view, consciousness is to be defined in terms of the kind of bodily behavior elicited by certain sort of stimuli. Such a definition of consciousness would fall under the heading of what is usually called behaviorism. Forms of behaviorism. There are two forms of behaviorism. You have the methodological and metaphysical behaviorism. 1. Methodological behaviorism is a method of approach to problems in the field of psychology. It consists in confining psychological theories and the procedures for evaluating those theories to observable behavior. 2. Metaphysical behaviorism, on the other hand, is the theory about the nature of consciousness and the analysis of expressions referring to consciousness. It is metaphysical, not methodological behaviorism that concerns you here. Behaviorism proposes that you define all expressions involving consciousness in terms of bodily behavior, which can be observed in others as easily as in oneself. Hence, behaviorism is seen as a typical third-person account. But such a view, behaviorism, must be carefully formulated, since it is obvious that a person who is conscious or who is in some particular conscious state may not be behaving in any noticeable way. He may just be flat on his back, eyes shut. Yet, he may still be conscious, having sensations and thoughts, and so on. He may be in pain, for example, without groaning or complaining. A typically behavioristic device for dealing with the fact that persons in a particular mental state may not be behaving in any particular way is to introduce the concept of a disposition to behave. Dispositions are properties of things such that, under certain circumstances, the thing that has the dispositional property will undergo a certain change. Brittleness, for example, is a dispositional property. A thing is brittle if and only if, under suitable circumstances, it will shatter. An object may have the dispositional property of brittleness and still never shatter. If you define thoughts, feelings, and wishes, and so on, in terms not of behavior, but of disposition to behave, then the man who hides his feelings behind a poker face would still have dispositions to behave in certain ways. So, to attribute consciousness or some particular state of consciousness is to attribute a disposition to behave in particular ways. The third person account does indeed do considerable justice to a great many of the concepts applicable exclusively to conscious beings. If you say of a person that he is ingenious, resourceful, ambitious, or considerate, you are referring predominantly to what he says and do. The crucial test for the application of these terms and indeed their basic content lie in behavior and behavioral dispositions. However, there are cases that offer difficulty to the third-person account, most especially those cases in which their essence lie in what happens inwardly. The most plausible candidates here are sensations, feeling, mental images, and thoughts. Let us concentrate on behaving sensations of pains, for example. When a heavy object falls on someone's feet, he turns pale, cries out, and limps about. That means he is obviously feeling pain. But what does it mean to feel pain? On the third-person account, it is just to behave in these ways under these circumstances, or at least to be disposed to so behave. However, such an analysis leaves out just the essential feature, the sharp, highly unpleasant sensation, so forcibly there is the forefront of consciousness. Surely, it is the inner sensation which is the immediate cause of the outward behavior of grimacing and limping about. But this inner cause is left out in the third-person account. The argument here is that particular behavior or disposition to behave is neither necessary nor sufficient condition for sensation. Not necessary because one can imagine a pain so great or so slight that there is no disposition to behave. Consider the Stoics, who have so trained themselves that they have exterminated any such disposition. Again, particular disposition or behavior is not a sufficient condition for sensation because you can imagine such dispositions arising from other causes, such as the desire to call attention to yourself, to deceive others, or imitate a person in pain. Feeling pain is one thing and behaving or being disposed to behave in certain ways is another. The feeling may produce the disposition to behave, but you cannot say they are identical, nor even that the one is a necessary or sufficient condition for the other. What is metaphysical behaviorism? Metaphysical behaviorism, on the other hand, is the theory about the nature of consciousness and the analysis of expressions referring to consciousness. The first person or subjective account of consciousness. So far, you have sought to define consciousness in terms of what you can observe in others. That is, you have treated consciousness as if it was simply a public or objective phenomenon. You have, however, overlooked a most obvious but important fact, that you yourself are conscious too, and that you do not have to restrict yourself to what you observe in others in trying to understand what consciousness is. According to the first-person account, if each of us turns his attention inward to what is going on in himself when he is conscious, then you will see that being conscious is not a matter of behaving in particular conscious ways. The behavior is merely the outward manifestation of the inner state, and this inner state is there to be observed by us in our individual cases. The first-person account of consciousness refers to that which results from attending to how things are in one's own case. For instance, when you ask a man who has been hit on the head whether he is conscious, what do you mean by that question, either in the affirmative or negative? It is our belief that if he is still conscious, he will respond to certain stimuli, such as opening his eyes when he is spoken to, or flinching at his noise, or even tries to get up. But assuming he is not conscious any longer, he will not be able to do those things until he regains his consciousnesses. Thus, consciousness could be defined in terms of the kind of bodily behavior elicited by certain sort of stimuli. The word consciousness has often been taken as a compact reference to all that is mysterious about the first person, but obviously there are some third-person aspects which are very relevant to the word. By the thesis of the first-person account of consciousness is not just behavior, rather, behind the behavior is a sharp agonizing sensation which is behind and the cause of the behavior. This calls for the causal theory of mind. There are, however, some challenges to the first-person account or the identity theory, for if the mind is the brain and the functions of the mind, such as thinking and deliberating, wishing and pondering, are electrophysical operations of the brain processes, how do you explain belief, faith, trust, and other extrasensory perceptions such as telepathy? Summary of Study Section 10. In Study Section 10, you have learned that 1. The nature of consciousness. It attempted an articulation of the nature of the human mind in the effort to understand the central attributes of consciousness. In sum, the session examines the first-person and the third-person account of consciousness. 2. The third-person account of consciousness, it is argued, defined consciousness in the person's response to stimuli. In other words, it is understood that one is conscious if one elicits certain forms of behavior corresponding to certain stimuli. And so, the third-person account of consciousness is another expression for behaviorism. 3. Some of the difficulties associated with third-person account, difficulties such as pretensions, imitations, and holding back of any corresponding behavior to show response to certain stimuli. This therefore necessitated the proposing of the first-person theory of consciousness, which relates to the mind-brain identity theory. 4. In first-person theory of consciousness, consciousness is not just behavior, rather, behind the behavior is a sharp agonizing sensation which is behind and the cause of the behavior. This calls for the causal theory of mind. 5. Some challenges to the first-person account or the identity theory. For if the mind is the brain and the functions of the mind, such as thinking and deliberating, wishing and pondering, are electrophysical operations of the brain processes, how do you explain belief, faith, trust, and other extrasensory perceptions such as telepathy? This is the end of Study Section 10. Thanks for listening.